लाइव स्ट्रीम शुरू कर दीजिए।
1 second, sir.
बता दीजिए शुरू हो गया तो फिर निशिता कैन टेक।
Recording.
Just in terms of format,
We are live, sir.
I can speak for like longer or shorter, but if people are, obviously people in this chat, in this meeting can ask questions later, but is there a mechanism for getting questions from people who are live streaming? Otherwise it can be just us chatting. I'm happy to do.
On the YouTube side, usually what happens is because they're live streamed from YouTube, so they'll put a comment there and we'll ask you then.
Okay. All right, so I'll just rely on you to
prefer, yeah, we prefer joining the YouTube link. I think there's less disturbance also. So that was more widely shared than the Zoom, I believe. So,
okay.
So that's all. So Ajay, has it gone live now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, it is live.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Yeah, you can see it on YouTube. Okay. All right. Good morning, everybody. I am Nishika Bhatia, Dr. Nishika Bhatia. I'm part of the JSBF International Strategy and Mobility, the team of International Strategy and Mobility. We are very excited today. It's another NIFTI lecture. NIFTI stands for New Ideas in Finance, Technology and Innovation. And we are very excited to have Professor Chesterman from NUS. I'll give you a little brief about NIFTI, and then Faisal is going to chat about Professor Chesterman. It's very interesting things about him, I believe, and especially the book. I'm excited to hear about his book. So NIFTI, as the name stands, we basically invite researchers and faculties to come and discuss ideas in finance, technology. It would be related to innovation, to finance law, different intersections, basically, whatever is the new coming ideas in finance. And Mr. Chesterman was a perfect fit for the lecture, and his book series. I think that will be a very interesting point. I want to ask a lot of questions towards the end. So that's it. I think Faisal, please take over, and maybe you can give an introduction about it.
Sure. Thanks so much, Nishika, and hello to those in the meeting and those watching streaming or perhaps recorded and watching later on. So I was delighted to accept this kind of invitation for 3 reasons. One, yes, I'm excited about the book, and I'll talk about that in a moment. 2, I was really impressed with the acronym NIFTI, and I'm a big fan of good acronyms. But thirdly, I've long been interested in the O.P. Jindal Global University. Actually, I met Raj Kumar, now the Vice Chancellor, must be around 15 years ago, when it was just an idea. And it's been a real delight to see how the university has thrived, how it's prospered. We've had alumni from NUS go on to take faculty positions. We've had students and faculty come and study here. So we've got a lot of connections. My only regret is I have not yet visited the campus. So this was as close as I could get. And so I'm there virtually, but really do look forward in the future to visiting in person. So what I'll do today is talk a bit about the regulation of artificial intelligence. So partly this is an encouragement to think about looking at the book, which there's a great big cover there. But primarily I'm interested in provoking questions and conversation. And so people in the Zoom meeting will be asking questions directly. I understand if you're live streaming it, there are ways to ask questions through comments, so please do. And maybe the first bit of background is sort of why I ended up working on this area at all, because my background traditionally was in public international law. I did my doctoral thesis on humanitarian intervention last century, and have worked in a variety of areas. But really the through line in my own research is public authority in crisis. And so my doctoral thesis on humanitarian intervention was, well, basically what happens and what legally should happen when a state turns on its own population. I then looked at post-conflict reconstruction. What can and should happen when the institutions of the state collapse? What role could international actors play? More recently, I'd looked at the national security agencies, intelligence services, and sort of what role public law could play when there are threats that threaten the very viability of the state. And the more I looked at technology over the past decade, the more I realized there was at least the potential for technology to pose a similar threat to regulation as we traditionally understand it, meaning public control of a set of activities with the potential for good and the potential for harm. So let me just share some slides so you're able to have more than just my image, and I'll talk through some ideas, and then, as I say, it's a provocation to conversation. So that's the title, We the Robots. The question mark is important because I'm not actually advocating rights for robots. That's a topic we could talk about if people are interested in, but it was really a provocation also to get people thinking about this. What I'm mainly talking about is the regulation of AI and the limits that it exposes in the law. And those two ideas are interlinked. So let me start with a photograph that's reasonably well known. This is a photograph from the iconic 1956 Dartmouth College Symposium, at which the term artificial intelligence is widely believed to have been coined. So these guys met at Dartmouth College, and it's an interesting illustration, not just for historical reasons, but because it highlights two things that have been important in the history of artificial intelligence. One is its striking lack of diversity, bunch of white men. And that's been a problem for AI throughout its half century or so history, because both in terms of the people who've been playing a lead role, although that is changing, we're seeing more and more diversity in the researchers of AI, but also in the data that it has access to. And you may well be familiar with the extent to which there are problems in the way in which artificial intelligence has relied on data that tends to be skewed in one direction, that permeates bias through the systems and either replicates or exacerbates bias. And so that's one of the concerns that's really pictured in this photograph. The second reason why the photograph is interesting, I think, and somewhat telling about artificial intelligence is the irrational ambition and optimism of these guys. Because this photograph was taken during a 2-month meeting, and they proposed to the Rockefeller Foundation back in 1956 that if they got funding for a 2-month retreat, basically they thought they could solve most of the problems of artificial intelligence. Now, more than half a century later, of course, we're far from that. But I use this illustration, again, as a watchword for the concern about overambitious estimations of what AI can achieve, which has often been contradicted by reality, to the point where people had to coin the term the AI winter, the idea that there is a mismatch between what people hope AI can achieve and what it actually delivers. So that's one photograph. A second photograph, another iconic image. This comes from about a decade later, the film 2001, the 1968 science fiction film that came out the same year as the book by Arthur C. Clarke. And this, of course, is the iconic image of HAL, the computer, which ultimately goes on to have to explain to his human crew that his mission, its mission, is more important than their lives. And this really speaks to a different kind of challenge that AI faces, which is the fear that many people experience when thinking about artificial intelligence, in particular, an intelligence that might put its own desires, its own values, its own interests above our own. Now, it's quite common for new technologies to inspire fear and concern, but it is quite unusual that artificial intelligence has seen some of the most striking expressions of anxiety come not from neo-Luddites, not come from scaremongers, but from people who really do understand the technology. And so we've got here quotes from people like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and the late Stephen Hawking. So all this to say, artificial intelligence is, there's no question, enormously important, but it poses challenges, it poses risks in terms of regulation. Again, meaning that idea of public control of a set of activities so that we can get the obvious benefits while mitigating the harms. So what are we actually talking about here? Well, by artificial intelligence, I'm using the term fairly broadly to mean machines, computer systems that perform cognitive functions similar to those that a human would normally be able to perform. I'm not talking, for the most part, about artificial general intelligence. I'm not talking about robot consciousness. I'm not talking about the idea of synthetic life forms. What I'm talking about primarily is narrow AI, meaning machines that can do things that would normally be done by a human. Machine learning means the ability of these computer systems to improve their behavior by themselves without additional input. And robotics is how these two types of system engage with the world. If you combine AI and machine learning, you get computer systems like the AlphaGo system that beat Lee Sedol in Go back in 2016. Combine AI and robotics, you get things like autopilot. Combine robotics and machine learning, you get things like the Roomba. So I hope all that's pretty obvious. We're not going to go into great detail on the technology, but that's at least a quick summary of where I'm starting off. So what are the challenges that artificial intelligence poses to regulation? Now, often this is somewhat overblown. Often there's a tendency to say, oh, we've got to throw out all of our regulation and start again, when in fact, most of the problems posed by artificial intelligence can in fact be solved by existing laws. But it is true that there are some ways in which it stretches those laws, in some ways it breaks those laws. And so I group the challenges, as I call them, into three groups. And the first is speed. This is not new to artificial intelligence. It's been a function of computerization for many years, but it really has come to the fore in terms of AI. And a good example is more than a decade old, which is the flash crash of 2010. And this was the time when the New York Stock Exchange, the Dow Jones Index, lost 1,000 points, lost $1 trillion worth of value. At the time, the biggest point drop in its history. And that happened within the space of 30 minutes. And then in the next 15 minutes, almost all of that value came back. And no one knew why. And very quickly, it was revealed that this was a function of high-frequency trading algorithms. These are computer programs that could trade themselves. And what this revealed is that although in theory, the law applied to securities regulation, whether those securities are being traded by computers or by humans, there is a big difference. If I'm trading with Nishika and I say, well, I'll sell you this, and then I buy it back, or she counter-offers, there is a certain amount of time that takes. Whereas if their high-frequency trading algorithms are engaging in these transactions, they can do so thousands of times per second. And indeed, that's what happened on the 6th of May, 2010, when there were tens and tens of thousands of transactions every second, which is what led to the spiraling down of prices. So again, in theory, the law applies to those computers the same way it would apply to individual traders. But in practice, the speed with which the computers operate poses more practical than conceptual challenges. And those practical challenges have been addressed in part through innovative ways of thinking about time, like an approach that suggests that time should not be regarded as a continuum, but as packets, because the incentive to trade more quickly currently exists. And one example of that is that there was a Chicago company back around a decade ago that paid, I think, $300 million to lay a dedicated fiber optic network connecting Chicago and New Jersey in order to shave 3 milliseconds off the amount of time it took to transmit an order from Chicago to New Jersey. So instead of allowing this sort of incremental change, you could have batch auctions. That's the idea, that instead of just privileging the person who trades first, which really puts a priority on speed, you could have break second, break time into units of 1/100th of a second rather than relying on milliseconds. But so anyway, that's one challenge, speed. As I said, it applies to many technologies other than AI, but AI, it's certainly one of the phenomena. The second and more unique to artificial intelligence is autonomy. And this is perhaps well understood. When a car driven by an autonomous driving system crashes, the question is asked, who's to blame? Is the driver to blame? What happens if there's no driver? What happens if there's not even a steering wheel? And this is unusual. It's not unique to artificial intelligence. There are plenty of things that are automatic in our societies, but autonomy suggests the ability of these entities, these machines, to take decisions themselves without those decisions necessarily being attributable back to a human actor. And that can pose some challenges, not always, but it can, but it depends in what context. So for example, in the well understood example of an autonomous vehicle, the fact that an autonomous vehicle injures someone is not necessarily a huge problem. If, for example, I injure Nishika because I'm driving badly and I crash into her, then it's my fault, and she might be able to sue me for damages. If I injure Nishika because my car blows up, then probably it's not my fault, but it might be the manufacturer's fault. And that's basically what we're likely to see in the area of many autonomous machines, which is a shift of responsibility from the user to the manufacturer. or in some cases, the owner. And indeed, we're already seeing that with autonomous vehicles, with proposals to shift liability across, and along with that will go insurance. So at the moment in many jurisdictions, actually, I'm not entirely sure about the situation in India, but certainly in places like Singapore, Australia, there is a requirement to have insurance for a driver in order to drive a car. And what we're likely to see is a shift from the driver paying for insurance to product liability insurance on the part of the manufacturer. That won't actually save anyone money, because probably what will happen is as the insurance premiums for drivers go down, the cost of vehicles will go up to take account of that insurance. But this is a second example of a challenge to the regulatory regime. It's not so much of a problem in the civil law, that is the law that allocates responsibility for wrongs. It is a bit more of a challenge in the case of criminal law, where the reasons why we hold people to account are slightly different. It's not just about allocating loss. In the case of the criminal law, it's about punishing, it's about deterring. And so if people are interested, we can talk about whether it would make sense to fine a vehicle for running a red light or exceeding a speed limit, as opposed to treating that as an error to be debugged. So this is a second potential challenge, autonomy, although, as I hope I'm making clear, many of the challenges that it gives rise to actually can be solved within the existing legal systems. The third challenge is opacity, and this is quite unusual to artificial intelligence, in particular AI, as developed over the last decade or so. Now, opacity itself, in the sense of meaning difficult to understand, is not new. Often computer systems are opaque because they're locked up, they're proprietary software. The owners or the producers don't want you to have access to them. We've also had examples of many areas of life where things are just complex. It requires expertise to understand it. Both of these challenges are overcomable by existing legal structures, either through access to subpoenas, which can require access to information that's otherwise held closely, or through experts who can help understand a problem. What is unusual about modern AI, in particular the machine learning systems that have become more popular and common in the last decade, is naturally opaque systems that are so complex, so difficult to understand that no human can understand them, not even an expert. And this does pose challenges, not always, but sometimes. There are some areas of life we don't really care about the detailed understanding of why something happens, how it works. In the medical field, for example, there are all sorts of medical procedures where we have randomized controlled trials, we roll out a treatment, and provided the statistics get us the right results, the right number of improvements, a small number of adverse effects, we're prepared to roll out a pharmaceutical, even if we don't understand at a molecular level how it's actually functioning, how it's addressing a disease. The situation is even more extreme in some cases in psychiatry, where there are various procedures in psychiatry, such as electroconvulsive therapy, which has been proven to be useful in treating some forms of depression, even though we don't quite understand why. So even though those systems might be opaque in the sense of being difficult to understand, that's not necessarily a problem in terms of allowing those activities to continue nonetheless. Compare that, for example, with a situation where a judge makes a decision either to determine the guilt or innocence of a person, to determine who gets access to a child or gets custody of a child, and the reasons become much more important. We would never accept, I think, at least in most legal systems, a judge making a determination and saying that this was based on a statistical analysis of past cases. We want individualized reasons. We want to understand not just why a decision was made, but how that decision was made and by whom. So these are some of the challenges. What are the answers? Well, unfortunately, for about 70 years, we didn't get much further than this guy. And some of you will recognize Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov was a great science fiction writer, not such a great legislator. His robot novels and short stories introduced the famous 3 laws of robotics back in 1942. Hard to disagree with, the idea that a robot shouldn't be injuring people, it should broadly obey orders, should broadly protect itself. But for about 70 years, from about 1942 up until the early 2010s, this was about as far as we got in terms of thinking about regulating AI. And the problem is that it misconceived the problem, it misconceived those challenges as both too hard and too easy. It misconceived them as being too hard in that the assumption appears to have been that we just need new rules to apply to these AI systems, and then we can solve the problems. It misunderstood the challenges as being too easy because the problem is not, in fact, coming up with new rules. The problem is actually how to apply them in practice. Nonetheless, we saw a proliferation of these guides, frameworks, principles, really taking off around 2016 into the latter part of that decade. So why in this period? It was partly the machine learning systems that I described earlier that became more common. You had these achievements like winning in Go, winning in Jeopardy. So it became clear that AI systems were becoming more sophisticated. But it's also in this period that we saw that the consequences of technology running amok went far beyond identity theft or the occasional person who might get hit by an autonomous vehicle. It could actually change world history, change an election. And so it was around this time that the Cambridge Analytica scandal became well understood. And indeed, the majority of that news broke in early 2018, the same 6-month period within which Google, Microsoft, and Facebook all rolled out their AI principles and frameworks, I think partly realizing that something needed to be done. So what do all these principles focus on? Well, as I've said, I don't think the problem is really a lack of rules. The problem is application. But when you cover them, when you survey them, you end up seeing that essentially there's a big overlap between most of those principles that resolve down to about six sets of ideas that people generally think are important: human control, transparency, safety, accountability, non-discrimination, and privacy. Again, nothing very controversial there. These all seem like perfectly admirable things. The question I would ask is actually, do we need these new rules? Safety basically is another way of saying that product liability should apply to AI systems the same way it applies to other products. Accountability is another way of saying that you shouldn't be able to do things through AI systems that you can't do on your own, and that the civil and criminal law should apply to AI systems the same way it applies to humans and corporations. Non-discrimination is just another way of saying that the AI systems should comply with the same laws that the rest of us are bound by. And privacy is just another way of saying that data protection is relevant consideration. Human control and transparency are a little bit different. And that actually points to two of the red lines that I highlight in the book that are worth exploring and probably are worth taking seriously. Human control, meaning that we should think long and hard before we delegate to artificial intelligence systems the ability to take decisions that should really be made by a human. And two examples I would give of that are the lethal autonomous weapons, making determinations in a battlefield situation as to who lives and who dies, or public sector decisions more generally. That is, government decision-making that should be exercised by an office holder, not delegated to a machine, in the same way that they shouldn't be able to delegate it to a company or anyone else. Transparency is the flip side of opacity that I highlighted earlier. And as I've made clear, that's not always a requirement. We don't always need to understand how certain decisions are made. But in some cases, we must. In particular, in the case of public sector decisions, I think there is a real requirement that we should be able to understand decisions. Now, the European Union has seen this focus on what's called a right to an explanation. And this right to an explanation sounds like a good thing, but it's far too limited. Too limited because the ability to challenge an adverse decision is a far cry from what transparency should mean. Because challenging an adverse decision, one, means you must know there was a decision made against you, and two, you must be able to bring some sort of challenge. When in fact, transparency must mean more than that, because we all have an interest in certain classes of decisions being made and the way in which they're made and by whom they are made. So instead of focusing on what the rules should be, I think it's more important to think about other questions like why we are trying to regulate, when we want to regulate, and then how we should regulate. So on the question of why, one reason we regulate is to try and address market failures. So this is, for example, the reason why we might want to make sure that losses fall appropriately in the case of autonomous vehicles. That if autonomous vehicles were killing people left, right, and center, people who had no ability to influence the development of those machines, that would be, in addition to a tragedy, inefficient. So it's much more sensible to push the onus onto the manufacturer to make sure that autonomous vehicles, when deployed, are safe. But we don't always just want to optimize outcomes. Sometimes we might want to support social or other policies. For example, the reason why we don't discriminate, the reason why we have prohibitions on bias is not because that's more efficient, but rather because it is a value that we hold to be dear, even if it were more efficient to do otherwise. So for example, even if an algorithm could choose employees most efficiently if it screened out either men or women, even if that were true, even if that were efficient, it shouldn't be able to do it because it's discriminatory. And so often AI systems are very good at optimizing, but many parts of life, many aspects of life aren't really ripe for optimization because the value that is protected by certain rights, certain laws, is not susceptible to that kind of means-based cost-benefit analysis. At the same time, a constraint on some governments is that they're wary of limiting innovation or driving it elsewhere. They are worried they'll lose their competitive advantage, and that's certainly the case in AI. In Singapore, for example, we had a review of the penal code a couple of years back, which explicitly concluded that we did not want to regulate artificial intelligence through the criminal law for fear that it would drive innovation elsewhere. And indeed, there are examples of that. 20 years ago, the United States imposed a moratorium on stem cell research, fearing that experimentation on stem cells might cross ethical lines. The primary consequence of that was to drive it elsewhere. And so that is a legitimate concern. At the moment, we've seen a real division between the US, Europe, and China in this area. And so one way of understanding this is that in the United States, there is a kind of market-based approach which has been dominant. You have major US technology companies that have been at the forefront of developing many areas of artificial intelligence, but no real federal regulation either of data or indeed of AI. Europe, of course, has been the opposite. Europe has had the lead in terms of data protection with, among other things, the General Data Protection Regulation of 2018, but has also now adopted a draft AI Act, which offers the possibility of Europe being at the forefront of AI regulation. There is then, of course, the question that many are asking within Europe, whether this will drive innovation into those other jurisdictions. But if you've got market-based approaches in the United States, rights-based approaches in Europe, China has been an interesting outlier in terms of its own experience, which is focused very much on sovereignty. And so until this year, really, I would have said that China was sort of the Wild West of artificial intelligence. One of the factors that affects AI development is access to data. And really until this year, China had the loosest restrictions on access to data, including personal data. And that's one reason why some people believe that China has been so successful in AI research and development. This year, however, we have seen the Personal Information Protection Act adopted in China, which came into force this month, and we've seen an effort to rein in technology companies. But you've certainly seen different experimentation, different approaches in these three broad areas, and many other smaller jurisdictions trying to work out how to position themselves. Slightly different question is, when should you regulate? And here it's useful to recall what's called the Collingwood Dilemma. And this dates back 40 years to a book, The Social Control of Technology by David Collingwood. And he pointed out that at an early stage of technological development, when control is possible, we don't know enough to warrant slowing that development. So at an early stage of social media, for example, back in 2004, when Facebook was just being launched, we could have regulated social media. The tools were available, but we didn't know what the harms were. If you wait, however, until 2021 and the harms of social media become very evident to all of us, the problem is that by that time, the costs of regulation have gone way up. And the difficulty of regulation has gone way up. So this is a real dilemma. So how do you address this? Well, some writers have drawn a comparison with the Precautionary Principle, which is an international environmental law phenomenon. And this is the idea that the fact that there is scientific uncertainty about a harm shouldn't mean that you fail to regulate it just because of that uncertainty. The difficulty is this can be used for almost any argument in favor of or against regulation. An alternative approach, which Vivian Balakrishnan, a minister in Singapore, uses what's called masterly activity, which is not doing nothing, but refraining from regulating while maintaining close engagement with technology developers and establishing things like regulatory sandboxes so that there are opportunities for experimentation. So we've seen this in Singapore, in London and elsewhere with financial technology, fintech, trying to offer sandboxes in which there can be experimentation with only limited regulation to avoid that dilemma of either driving innovation elsewhere or over-regulating to the point that it constrains innovation. I'm getting towards the end because I am interested in Q&A, but I'll just have one more sort of section to talk about why we regulate. And there's a tendency here to focus on supply when I think what we should focus on is demand. By supply, I mean that if there's a hammer, if we have a hammer, we look around for nails to hit. And I think there's been a tendency to think about artificial intelligence in that way. But actually, if we look at the reasons why we want to regulate, this can be helpful. And again, I distinguish between three. And the first is there are some areas we just want to manage the risks. So in autonomous vehicles, for example, we just want them to be safe. This is, if you like, a kind of utilitarian calculus. We want to get the benefits, minimize the costs. And AI is actually quite good at that. AI might even be able to help with that. And so that offers a reasonably clear approach that we want to make sure that things are safe, that loss lies where it should, and that we therefore get the benefits while minimizing or mitigating the harms. But there are some areas where safety and optimization aren't enough. There are some areas where we should just draw red lines. And so I touched on lethal autonomous weapons. And this is where I think we should draw a red line. And it's important to be clear that the reason for drawing a red line at lethal autonomous weapons is not because they will be more dangerous. It is entirely possible. Indeed, I think it's highly likely that lethal autonomous weapons will be safer than humans. Many war crimes happen because people get either angry or tired, they are racist or sexist. These are things that machines can be designed to avoid. But the reason why we should nonetheless maintain these decisions within human hands is not because the humans will make better decisions, but because the humans will make more accountable decisions, and because these are moral questions with which a human should be forced to grapple and then be held accountable for that grappling afterwards. There is a third category where it's not just a matter of a human making a decision, but a particular human making a decision. There are areas of life where the legitimacy of the decision is tied not just to the quality of the decision or the fact that a human has made it, but the fact that that human exists within a particular political hierarchy. And here I'll give the example of a judge. And again, I touched on this earlier. If a judge makes a determination about the custody of your children, whether you go to prison or not, and then says that that is on the basis of a statistical model that he or she cannot understand, that would be unjust. That would be unjust on its face, because the legitimacy of these decisions come partly from the reasons and partly from the fact that it's made by that person. So he or she should not be able to outsource that decision to anyone else, whether it's a machine, a company, or some other interest. So to wrap up, all of this to say that there are interesting challenges that AI poses. This is clearly more than just a theoretical excursus. I mentioned the EU draft artificial intelligence regulation. It was very quickly argued that all this regulation would do is drive innovation elsewhere, with some people posing, trying to put a dollar figure on the amount that the European Union would lose. More recently, we've even had examples where AI systems have pushed at the limits of the law in terms of the ability to file a patent. And so there have been around the world efforts to determine whether an AI system can be recognized as an inventor. And this failed in the European Union, in Britain, in the United States. But then in August this year, in the space of a week, both Australia and South Africa recognized AI systems as inventors for the purposes of patent law. And I'm curious what the situation has been like in India, whether this has been tried. I should emphasize that the AI system does not therefore own the patent. The AI system can't own anything, but the AI system is credited as the inventor for the purposes of the patent application. So all of this by way of provocation. This is just a slide that points out the number of people who are writing in this area. If people are really interested, we can go and situate ourselves where we are. But all to say, we've come a long way from those gentlemen standing around or lying around in Dartmouth College. And I'm very excited to hear your questions and try and answer them. And if you want to learn more, you can find out more by looking at the book, which is here. Thanks very much, and I'll stop the share and look forward to having an exchange of views. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. This is very interesting. I didn't think if I told you this. I'm not from a law background, but I'm a mathematician, and I did my PhD in optimization. So it was very interesting, and I do understand that this has been a very topic which I really like. So one of the questions which I had, because you mentioned the Tesla example, I don't know if this happened in the case or maybe I read it somewhere else, but I read something like this, that if it's an automated vehicle with some passenger sitting there, and let's say on the crossing there's 5-10 people. So if the AI has to make a decision between, and if there's likelihood there's going to be an accident, and the AI has to make a decision between saving the owner versus those 10 people. And I think the AI saved the owner, not the 10 people or something like that. Or maybe there was just a fictional story I read. What does the law say about it? Which is the better choice to make there?
Right. So this is the famous trolley problem. This is an ethical problem that goes back centuries, I think, but certainly at least 1 century. So we'll start with the ethical dilemma and then apply it to the machine. So the ethical dilemma is there's a train that's going on a track, and you are standing by a switch. There's one person stuck. There's one person there's 5 people on the track who are going to get killed. But there's a switch. If you pull the switch, it'll divert the train. It'll go to a different track, and there's only one person. So do you pull the switch? And you can survey people. There's no right or wrong answer here because it depends on your ethical framework. So if your ethical framework is utilitarianism, the greatest benefit to the greatest number, then of course you would pull the switch because one person dies versus 5 people dying. Net result is positive, and that's one ethical framework. But there's another ethical framework, deontology, which means sort of non-consequentialism, that you don't evaluate decisions just based on their consequences. You evaluate them based on whether they're right or not. And most of us feel some sort of visceral concern that, okay, even if we're notionally saving 4 lives, this one person that we're killing is dying because of my choice. And so this is why if you survey people, you get different responses to that question, and then there are variations. Now, apply this to the machine. So you asked what the legal position is. The law requires us to be, if it's a human driving, requires us to be a reasonable driver. And the reality is that barring some catastrophic malfunction, an AI system is going to be much more effective as a driver than most of us. Its reaction time will be faster, and almost certainly the solution to your dilemma is to brake. But yes, there is an extreme scenario. And so what should the result be? So if people are really interested, MIT has the moral machine, which offers dozens of variations of this. But the most telling finding, I think, is that when asked, many people surveyed were asked, okay, so if it's a choice between killing the driver and killing 10 school children, most people will say, yeah, you should sacrifice the driver. And then there's the follow-up question, would you ever get into a car programmed in this way? No. Mm-hmm. So most vehicle manufacturers have prioritized saving the driver, basically. But it's extremely unlikely that you would have a scenario in which this sort of limit case of actually killing 10 school children would come up, because it's so unlikely as to be almost not worth considering, except that it's interesting. And it does pose these challenging ethical dilemmas that ethicists love to grapple with, and that fiction writers do as well. But yeah, it's a long way of saying that the law says you've got to behave reasonably. And so if I'm driving, and if I swerve because there's a pigeon on the road and I swerve onto the footpath and kill someone, probably I have not behaved reasonably. And that's careless driving, possibly reckless driving. But if there's a baby on the road and I swerve and kill someone, then maybe that is reasonable.
Oh, okay. Because if you think about, it's very interesting. But if you think from just an AI perspective, or just like that machine thinking, the optimization perspective, they might, just benefit the cost benefit analysis that, okay, saving the driver is more profitable than saving 10, people on the road. So that is, I agree. So it's a very interesting thought. I agree. Because one thing which I've always, I've asked a lot of economists this, because there are a lot of economists in JSPF. The way optimization works, the way we design algorithms there, we assume that human beings are rational decision makers. That they'll
That's
always.
your first mistake.
That's the first mistake. So it's very fun to talk to economists about, and I think there's some questions coming up there. We'll just have a look and get back to you on the questions.
Thank you, Nishika. Thank you, Professor Chesterman. This it was a fantastic talk. I'm sure there are many more questions. I do have a question, but I'll ask that later. There is a question from Arkaja Chakravarti, who is a professor at JSPF. I'm going to read it out. AI and robotics can be an answer for increasing competition and higher wages. This may also help countries to become more independent in the manufacturing sector, for instance. Is there a way regulatory changes may facilitate such use of AI or robotics? And more importantly, should they?
So to increase wages, you said?
There may be an answer for increasing competition and higher wages.
So the impact of AI on the economy, there's no question it will add to the economy. But one serious concern is, I'm not entirely sure I'm answering the question, but I'll just say a little bit first about the impact on the economy and the impact on jobs. The impact on the economy, certainly it's a growth area, and there's enormous scope. So a country like India, with its expertise in computing, has an enormous amount to gain in terms of wealth creation. The big question is how widely that will be distributed, because there are real concerns about the extent to which AI will shift both employment and the tax base. It'll shift employment because increasing automation will reduce certain sectors of the economy employability. Now, for a long time, people worried that this would just be the kind of poorest would suffer the most. But actually, many of the studies, at least that I've been seeing, suggest that it's in fact the mid-ranking people who are most at risk, because the manual labor requires hand-eye coordination. These are skills that took humans hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years to develop. And that's quite hard to replicate in AI systems. That's why even autonomous vehicles are quite difficult to deploy effectively because of the many things that go on in a person's head when they're driving, for example, or manufacture, or even things like street sweeping. It's quite a challenge, or fruit picking. It's quite a challenge to develop AI systems. The things that are easy for AI systems to develop, and I apologize to your undergraduates, is essentially undergraduate type education. So accounting, radiology, things that are conceptual rather than manual and repetitive. Those are the things that are easiest for AI systems to replicate. And so I think 20 years from now, things like accounting, radiology, the analysis of images, these are things that machines do much better than humans. And although at the moment, I think most of us would be wary about handing over our medical diagnosis to a machine, if you're asked, well, do you want your lung X-ray to be examined by a doctor who's seen 1,000 of these, or a computer system that's analyzed millions of them? Well, probably you want both, but eventually the doctor's role is going to be diminished. So that's one question in terms of the equitable distribution and what jobs there will be. And this is one reason why, projecting into the future, there's a lively discussion about whether universal basic income is something we should be thinking about if some of those jobs don't come back. Because there is a real danger that, yes, there's enormous wealth creation, but it's concentrated. It's concentrated in the hands of companies. And that's linked with the second economic problem, which is the tax base. So at the moment, lots of governments get a lot of their income through income tax. And at the moment, many jurisdictions, the taxes on investment in capital are less than what is paid in income tax. So at the moment, many jurisdictions, there's in fact an incentive for companies to not employ people, but to use machines for various functions. And that poses two problems. One, it exacerbates that first challenge of unemployment. But two, it reduces the tax base for government precisely at the point when, as I've been saying, we probably need more regulatory tools to both take advantage of AI systems and to minimize or mitigate the harms. So I'm not sure if I answered his question exactly, if he has a follow-up that can maybe clarify whether I'm getting to his point or not.
No, I think, I think you did answer it, especially on the effect, its effect on economy. And its differential effect on different sectors, especially. I have a follow-up question, and it's a much broader scope, I guess. I'm not sure. I'm an anthropologist by training, and this seems to be a problem. The kind of issues with law we are facing, and even social organization in general with AI is something akin to what happened in 16th, 17th century when the idea of corporation started to take roots, and then eventually, especially in the Western legal frameworks, I mean that is the legal framework, corporation was made into a personality. It was made into an object which having rights and duties and responsibilities to it. It seems like we are in a way, though AI are not I mean AI instruments are not institutions as big as corporations, so they won't be carrying that kind of sociological weight, if I can put it in those terms. But still, the regulatory aspects seem to be taking cue from that historical experience. I mean, if you have thoughts about if there is a legal path in this direction that can be accessed or not.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating question, and indeed, there's a whole literature and one chapter in the book I talk about legal personality, and so you're right that there is a lot of speculation about AI systems either being similar to corporations, the sort of artificial legal entity, or potentially being like humans, a natural entity. So this is a fundamental question for all legal systems. And this actually partly gets to Krishna's question in the comments. So all legal systems, it's important to work out who are your subjects, who can be a legal person, who can have rights and obligations imposed on them. And it's kind of shocking the more you look at this to find out how untheorized that is. Because basically the answer, who is a legal subject, who can be a subject of law, is anyone the legal system wants to. So in India, for example, there are temples with legal personality. New Zealand has a river with legal personality. In Ecuador, the entire ecosystem has been given legal personality. So could an AI system be given legal personality? Definitely. Should it? I would say no, at least not yet. And I'd break that down into the reasons why you might want to attribute responsibility. The first thing to say is the biggest problem is actually that artificial intelligence is too general a category. It encompasses everything from algorithms to Roombas to all sorts of things. So you could give every autonomous vehicle, for example, legal personality, the same as a corporation, but it'd be very hard to do in a general sense. But if we're taking it seriously, there are kind of 2.5 reasons why we might want to give legal personality. One is so you can blame someone when things go wrong. The second is so we can reward someone when things go right. And then the half is the kind of artificial general intelligence thing I'll get to at the end. So in terms of blaming someone when things go wrong, this goes back to things like autonomous vehicles. That if you're worried about autonomous vehicles not being able to sue anyone, then maybe, yeah, if the autonomous vehicle was its own legal person, you sue the autonomous vehicle. That sounds good, but the only reason to sue someone, candidly, is so that you can get their money. And so unless that autonomous vehicle also has money, it's very inefficient to sue it, not least because the main consequence of saying you have to sue the car is you're protecting the company that made the car. So in terms of when things go wrong, I don't think there's actually a good argument for legal personality. You do see a lot of excitement about the idea of punishing robots, of destroying robots, decommissioning them. I think that's more emotional than rational. So I don't think that makes a lot of sense. The second argument is so you can reward someone when things go right. So I mentioned the patent application. Increasingly, AI systems are creating things. They're writing poetry. Eventually, they'll be writing novels. They're writing news stories. There was a case in China where an automatically generated news story was given some measure of copyright protection. And so there's an argument that that you should recognize that the AI system is creating. And so then again, there's a kind of split. There are two reasons why you might want to recognize personality. Either because it's kind of becoming like a human and has some sort of natural ability. I don't think we're anywhere near that at the moment. Or for the same reason that you recognize patent law, that you recognize copyright law, to incentivize this behavior. Because if you don't recognize the robot, the AI system as having created something, then there's no incentive to create. Now, I don't think that holds water either, because humans need incentivization. AI systems need programming and power. So I don't think either of those arguments hold. The half argument for legal personality, and this I am a little bit sympathetic to this, is that it is not impossible that 50 years, 100 years from now, AI systems do assume some kind of consciousness. And so there's a kind of serious argument that we should recognize AI rights in the hope that eventually it'll recognize ours. The problem with this approach is linked with what's called the Android Fallacy. That for many of us, when we think about artificial intelligence in that kind of robot consciousness sense, we're prisoners of our science fiction reading. So I put up the photo of Isaac Asimov. Asimov was a great writer, pretty terrible legislator, but he planted also an unrealistic idea of what AI would look like. Because AI, if we ever have sort of robot consciousness, it's not going to be human-shaped, human-level consciousness. There's no reason for it to be in human form. This is what's called the Android Fallacy, that we tend to anthropomorphize. If we ever get to human-level intelligence, very quickly it will get vastly smarter than us. And so coming back to legal personality, you could hope, perhaps, if we recognize AI as legal persons, then maybe at that point in the future, it will also recognize us as legal persons. But as I say, at the moment, that's all too speculative to be taken seriously at the moment.
That is very interesting. I have a follow-up question to it, but I'll let other people ask and then I'll come back to you later.
Yeah, so I have a question for Professor Chesterman. India has recognized privacy as a fundamental right. We still don't have a statute. We have a bill that's still pending in the in legislation, but we've still not had an act for protection of data in India yet. So in a situation like this, what do you think should our major concerns be if we want to implement an AI law, or even think about having a legislation for regulating AI? Because our government uses a lot of AI already. So yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the more interesting conversations I've had about this was actually with some counterparts in Estonia. So Estonia, like Singapore, is a small, very techno-savvy country. And they were being asked the same question by their government: what should we put in an AI Act? And they basically argued you shouldn't have one AI Act. And indeed, I think there is an argument that attempting to bring it all under one piece of legislation is a mistake, because there are not just lots of different technologies, there are lots of discrete problems. So for example, autonomous vehicles pose very different questions from the way in which the financial sector or medical technology should be regulated. So I would want to start specific with legislation, but broad in terms of rights protection, which links back to your privacy right. So one of the things I argue for in the book is an AI ombudsperson. It doesn't have to be called an ombudsperson, but I think there should be some rules but a roving institution with a broad mandate. So the rules are things that I highlighted earlier, like human control, that you shouldn't be outsourcing activities that should be either performed by a human or by a specific human in the case of government. And red lines in terms of transparency, that certain classes of decision need to be understandable. And so if that means that you can't use a machine learning system with billions of variables, then so be it. And even if the cost is less accuracy for more accountability, in some cases, that's a trade-off worth making. The thing that I do think is worth establishing at a general level is this idea of an ombudsperson or some kind of roving institution that looks across government activities and looks across sectors to identify areas in which either rights are being violated or rights are not being adequately addressed in new technologies. So I do think that the concern, if, say, India went down the path of the European Union with the AI Act in Europe is a great sort of planting of the flag, but it's an extremely broad definition of artificial intelligence, and its unacceptable usage policy could potentially stop all sorts of research into facial recognition, which might be desirable. So yeah, long way of saying I would have a kind of I would create an entity that will look out for the problems to try and identify those problems. But in terms of the solutions, I would do them more specific rather than general, for fear that you'll unnecessarily constrain innovation or just drive it elsewhere.
Thank you so much.
Are there any more questions?
There is a question from Professor Amlan. He was watching from YouTube. He's sorry. He says that in the context of supply rather than the demand leading the way of AI, where do we anticipate demand for AI to be highest in future? He also says that it is difficult to think about demand when we are not sure exactly what we are going to get from AI. What do you have to say about that?
Yes, I mean, it's very hard to speculate about the future. I think a few years back, many of us, myself included, thought that autonomous vehicles were just around the corner. That's clearly not, it's clearly further ahead than that. But I think in areas like health, wealth, and transportation, we're going to see a lot of movement, and those are areas that are ripe for regulation. So healthcare, increasing use of telemedicine, increasing use of diagnostic tools that I mentioned earlier. This is important, but it does pose some challenges, because most of the medical law and certainly medical ethics relies on principles like patient autonomy and the doctor-patient relationship. So patient autonomy requires us to make informed consent, but how do we make informed consent when we don't understand the technology that's going to be treating us? And what happens to the doctor-patient relationship when the doctor might not understand the treatment that she's prescribing? So I think that's one area that we can certainly see that that's going to be developing very quickly, and it will need medical and ethical and legal rules to help govern it. Transportation. I think we're definitely going to see a lot of movement in transportation. The development of drones that are self-flying, autonomous vehicles. That I think is reasonably easy to regulate. Many jurisdictions, I'm not sure about India, but many jurisdictions have a kind of legal problem that will need to be solved. That at the moment in some countries, for example, it's illegal to leave a car unattended. Every car must have a driver. And so that would make an autonomous taxi illegal by itself. So that's something that can be fixed. In terms of liability frameworks, I mentioned earlier that we probably need to shift insurance from insuring the driver to insuring the vehicle. One solution to that that's been adopted in a few countries is you just you require everyone to be insured. And then rather than after an injury, someone has to sue in order to recover, you just get a payout from a government system. And so that's the case, for example, my own home state of Victoria in Australia. And then in finance, we're also seeing a lot of movement and the rise of so-called robo-traders, high-frequency trading algorithms. We've seen some movement there to regulate. Yeah, Professor Amlan is right that it's very hard to project too far into the future. But I think these are three areas in which it's pretty clear that we're going to see greater innovation and that it's hopefully at least clear what the aim should be. One last thing that I think is, I fear I'm kind of in a losing battle that I highlighted earlier also is lethal autonomous weapons. So last year, 2020, in Libya, it appears that an autonomous drone with self-targeting ability was deployed. So the time to draw a line to stop lethal autonomous weapons was probably last year. But it doesn't mean it's hopeless, because there are plenty of examples of weapons technologies that we as a community have outlawed. So chemical weapons, biological weapons, a bit more controversial in the context of India, nuclear weapons. At least most of the world has said we don't want these weapons, and we don't want them to proliferate, and we don't want them to be used. And one could say, well, but nuclear weapons still exist. That's true, but it is amazing that this sort of 1940s technology is only possessed by a handful of countries, and no weapons have been used in anger since the Second World War. So I do think there's hope.
Okay. Are there any more questions?
No, I think it's covered.
Okay. The couple of pointers, I mean, I'm not sure if these are even relevant. One is that you mentioned the question of consciousness for AI instruments or AI systems. I mean, that even philosophically speaking, there have been attempts or very unself-conscious ways of doing that. Nations have been ascribed consciousness. The nation states have been ascribed consciousness. People have tried to ascribe consciousness to corporations, for example. I'm not sure how much in what context legal entities accept that or not. But I mean, one is to have an artificial personality given, that is, we treat that as a personality for practical purposes. The other is to treat it as naturally having a certain type of consciousness, even having it developed over a period of time. That seems to be, is there any thought or any debate around that has taken place? I mean, at least in anthropology, even human consciousness is being questioned by a lot of places, because a lot of things we think are quite shared in many ways. So if there is any thought or any discussions that have taken place on that level.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating question. It gets beyond my own area of expertise, but certainly what I've read, I don't think there's any serious argument that we're on a path to consciousness in the near term. But what each step towards greater sophistication of AI systems linked with the question of consciousness, I think has tended to reveal how little we understand our own consciousness. And so that's one problem. I mean, this harkens back to Alan Turing's famous imitation game. So Turing, back in 1950, posited that if people couldn't tell the difference between a computer and a person, then the computer had intelligence comparable to that of a person. That's not actually a good measure of intelligence. That's a good measure of imitation. And so there have been competitions like the Turing test over the years where the ones that tended to win early on would make mistakes. And so people would think, aha, the person writing made a mistake, so that's probably a human. It's not actually a good measure. And in fact, I think it's not even a good aspiration for many computer scientists. I mean, the reason why we succeeded in achieving flight was not because we copied birds with flapping of wings, but because the Wright brothers studied aerodynamics. When we started thinking about autonomous vehicles, I don't think anyone seriously suggested that you should design a humanoid robot that would sit behind the wheel, hold it with hands, and then manipulate the pedals with feet. Similarly, in terms of what AI can offer us, rather than trying to replicate whatever consciousness is in humans, which is something that developed over millions of years, layer upon layer of our brain function, computers are very good at solving problems. Back to Nishika's point about optimization. Computers are great at optimization. Humans not always so good. So I think we're some distance from anything like achieving consciousness in robots, at least as far as I can tell.
Thank you. Okay, if there are, there are no more questions, then let me take this opportunity on behalf of the Office of International Strategy and Mobility to thank Professor Simon Chesterman for having delivered a very fantastic talk and patiently engaged with all our questions. It was indeed very enlightening, and I also thank Nishika and Shavari for making this event possible. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Nishika.
Thank you, Professor Chesterman. It was really fun. Thank you.
Okay, and hopefully we get to catch up in person one day.
Yes.
Okay.